Welcome back to Major Religions of the West. In today's lecture, we're going to be talking about an introduction to Islam. And so in this introduction, we'll talk a little bit about some of the beliefs in Islam and then kind of a brief overview of some of its history, its foundations there with Muhammad, and then also going up into and through some of its conquests as well, looking at some of its religious traditions, a small amount of theology, those kinds of things. Just trying to give you kind of an overall broad view of Islam, a little bit about today, but mostly we'll be focusing on its foundations and its past, and that'll kind of help us see why it is what it is today. All right, so like Judaism and Christianity, Islam is one of the great monotheistic faiths that traces its ancestry to Abraham. Muslims share certain core beliefs, but the cultural practices, interpretations, and realities of Islam vary across space and time. And what I mean by that, they share some core beliefs, but there is a good deal of variety. I mean the same thing that I explained about Judaism and Christianity. You can't take all Jews and put them in a box and say Jews believe this, because not all Jews believe exactly the same things or emphasize the same things within their religion, and not all Christians believe exactly the same thing and emphasize the same thing in their religion either. And so it's the same with Muslims. They are expanded over multiple countries and multiple cultures and languages. And so we don't see that they all simply believe exactly the same thing. And that shouldn't surprise us at this point. We should come to kind of expect that that's the case with most religions. If you look at Buddhism, you're going to find the same thing. In Hinduism, you're going to find the same thing. There's probably some things that tie them together. That's why they're all Buddhists or they're all Hindus or whichever religion. But there's going to be a great deal of variety as well. And we should expect that with Muslims also. Although Islam has more than 1 billion followers, living in some 56 countries around the world, many in the West know little about the faith and are familiar only with the actions of the radical extremists. It's probably not surprising to anybody. We have that phrase, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and certainly that is going to be true. And then here also, with those radical extremists, often all that most people are, all that some people at least are familiar with is just what that group does, because of suicide bombings or mass shootings or using cars to run through crowds, whatever it might be. That's going to get the attention of the media. What doesn't get the attention of the media is the Muslims who live next door to probably most of us at this point. As much as Islam has spread throughout the United States, we probably have Muslim neighbors. And so what doesn't get the attention of the media is all those folks that live right here next to us that care mostly about what everybody else cares about. They've got a job, they've got a family, and they're focused on that. Religion certainly is going to be a big part of their life, like it is for many of you, but it is not that they're plotting and planning to go out and, be suicide bombers. They are just trying to have a good life, provide for their families like everybody else. But that's not what winds up in the media, and so what we know mostly about are those few extremists. The geographic, cultural, and religious diversity of Islam reflects its status as a world religion and a global presence and impact. It is literally stretching completely around the world at this point, meaning that certainly there are the Muslims that are there in the Middle East, but if you travel east, you're going to find them in India, and you're going to find them in China, and then you're going to find them as you wrap around the world in the United States. You're going to find them in Europe. You're going to find them in Africa. They are going to be as broad spread as some of the other religions are, but in this case, I was going to say, especially like Christianity, it's all around the world, and so is Islam. Islam is the second largest and one of the fastest growing of the world's religions, and includes many peoples, races, languages, ethnic cultures, tribes, and cultures. Only 20% of the world's Muslims are Arab. The majority of Muslims live in Asia and African societies, which is a surprise to many people, because when we think Muslim, most people's ideas turn almost immediately to the Middle East. But again, Asia and Africa has an exceedingly large number of Muslims in those as well. So you start thinking global and not just pockets here and there, but its presence is quite broad. All right, Islam is a visible presence in the West as the second largest religion in Europe and is soon to be the second largest in America. Despite Islamic community's size, global presence, and significance, many myths, stereotypes, and misinformation about Islam and Muslims abound. Again, a lot of that just goes back to the media and what we tend to see, or what perhaps was emphasized by past generations, and we sometimes haven't had enough experience and time with Muslims on a personal level to really know what it is that they're thinking or what it is that they're about. So stereotypes abound. Okay. The study of Islam today is often motivated by and cannot escape the threat that radical Islam, Muslim extremists and terrorists, have posed to their own societies and to the West. It really kind of can't be helped at this point that motivates much of the study of Islam. Many of you perhaps are sitting here listening to this and you're interested perhaps because, hey, I don't know much about them and we see these folks on the news and that's why you want to learn, not because you've got a Muslim neighbor down the street who you think it would be interesting to know what it is that they believe. Now, that might be one of some of you, but for the most part, it's folks who want to know because we see the extremists on television. In fact, one of the professors that I've listened to considerably on this topic said that when he first got into studying Islam, people asked him why he was bothering to study that particular religion. It was before all of the different terrorist acts began to occur throughout the world, and they just were like, why would you study that? I mean, there's no point. You're not going to be able to use it or make a living doing this. And now he's considered one of the experts in the United States and is consulted often even by the U.S. government about what Muslims believe and what can be expected of them, with this kind of behavior, that kind of behavior. So he's considered one of the experts, and it's very valuable today. So things have changed considerably over the past few years, and certainly one of the most obviously famous and biggest changes came after September the 11th. So a lot of the motivation comes, sadly, not from wanting to get to know them and their religion, but because of the extremist. Although all Muslims believe in God, the Quran, and the teachings of Muhammad, there is a rich diversity of interpretation and cultural practices. Understanding Islam requires a bridging of religion, history, politics, and culture. The word Islam means submission or surrender, right? So if you've wondered what that word might translate as, it's submission or surrender, and in this case really submitting or surrendering to the will of God. So understanding their religion and history and the culture and everything that it came from, it's going to be really important. It's going to be helpful when it comes to understanding their views on different topics and understanding some of their theology. So that's kind of where we're headed. A Muslim seeks to follow and actualize God's will in history as an individual member of his community of faith. The Muslim community is a transnational community. It's broad. It goes across country lines. It's across national lines. It is God-ordained and guided to spread an Islamic order to create a socially just society. So since it crosses these national boundaries, even though it crosses these national boundaries, really what is important here is the will of God, and it is a God-centered religion, even more so than a government-centered religion. It's more important to follow God's laws even than the laws of the government that you happen to be under. So Islam belongs to the family of the great monotheistic faiths, the children of Abraham. So if you recall, Abraham is the father of the Jews, and so then eventually Jesus was a Jew, and so the Christian line of religion comes from Father Abraham. But also remember that Abraham had two sons. Now he only had one son with Sarah, and that was Isaac. As we talked about with Judaism, and all of the Jews come through that line there of Isaac. But the But Abraham had another son previously, but he didn't have that son with Sarah. He had it with Hagar. And so that son's name is Ishmael, right? So why, kind of how does this come about? Okay, so Abraham and Sarah were promised that they were going to have a son, and from that son the whole world's going to be blessed, and the descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars and all this stuff. Well, they start getting older. Abraham's probably around 100, I think. Sarah was like 90 or 98. I don't remember the exact age. Somewhere in there. They're both getting older, but they still have children. Apparently folks were living longer and having children at later dates when they were alive on the planet. So they were still, they started becoming concerned because they're getting older. And so what Sarah does is she says, look, take my handmaiden, it's a servant here, take Hagar and get her pregnant. And then through tradition at that time, as Hagar's giving birth, Hagar, would sit on Sarah's lap, and as the child passed through Sarah's legs as it was being born, it comes from Hagar's womb, but she's sitting on Sarah's lap, so the child would go through Sarah's legs, and symbolically, legally, then that child becomes the child of Sarah, right? So it's this idea of I can't have children, but through this person, as the child passes through my legs, the child becomes mine. So that takes place, and then Sarah becomes pregnant, rather surprisingly, and when their child is born, Sarah and Abraham's child is born, a son, then Sarah becomes jealous, perhaps, suspicious, perhaps, other adjectives there. But either way, she decides that she doesn't want Hagar and Ishmael to be there any longer because, this is Abraham's child as well. And so she persuades Abraham to kick them out. And so Abraham does put them out into the wilderness, and they wander for a time, but eventually God does come to them and says, look, Hagar here, your son is going to also father a great nation, right? And so from Isaac, Abraham's son Isaac, we get the Jews, and then from Abraham's son Ishmael, we get the Arabs. Now, an Arab is a person who lives there, we just say in the Middle East, or is from the Arabian desert, is that kind of the idea. They don't have to be specifically just from that desert. But somebody who lives there kind of in the Middle East, and obviously they move around some as well. They're going to be nomads, but that's kind of that region of the world. An Arab is somebody who's from that region. A Muslim is someone who is a follower of the religion Islam. And we'll see that Islam and Muslim are tied together, just like Christian is tied to Christianity, but the words don't sound completely similar to many people, but we'll see that Islam and Muslim really are tied together. So Arab is more a geographical term. Muslim is a person who follows the religion of Islam. If you've ever kind of wondered how the words are, kind of move around, remember that within Judaism, they're Jews, they're Hebrews, and there's multiple names for them as well. Yes, and so Ishmael and Hagar are put out into the wilderness, and they're going to father. They're not going to father. Ishmael will be the father of the Arab races that will eventually become the Muslims. So they are also the children of Abraham, right? Okay. Okay. A little theology within Islam. Although specific and significant differences exist among Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all three faiths share one profound belief, that is monotheism. So there's only one God. They believe in that one God who is the creator, sustainer, and ruler of the universe. Should sound familiar. Jews, Christians, we've already talked about it. All believe in angels, Satan, prophets, revelation, moral accountability and responsibility, divine judgment, eternal punishment, and reward. So just like, again, not all Jews believe in all of these things. Not all Christians believe in all of these things. Not all Christians believe in angels. Not all Jews believe in angels. So when we say Muslims all believe in this, for the most part, this is what Muslims are going to believe. So those are the kind of the things that they've got in common with Judaism and Christianity as far as their theology goes. Islam has a significant impact on world affairs. It is a dynamic religion that interfaces and at times competes with other faiths. In contrast to separation of church and state, many Muslims, religion and society, faith and power are closely intertwined. So from the creation of the first Muslim community in the 7th century, Arabia from that first creation of the Muslim community in the 7th century, Arabia, to contemporary times, Muslims have debated and sought to implement God's will in their personal lives as well as in their public lives. And if you're Jewish or Christian, that should sound really familiar to you. What do I do vis-a-vis God's will versus my own personal life or public life? Or how do I manage myself within society and the state, trying to line up my religious beliefs with the laws and cultural norms of the society that I live in? So that's something that the Muslims faced then, as we'll see, and certainly something that they still face today. Okay. From the time of Muhammad to the present, Muslims have engaged in a continuous process of applying Islam to the realities of life, again, like Jews and Christians. Islamic law, theology, and mysticism reflects this complex process. Religious doctrines, laws, and practices result not only from a sacred text, but also from fallible interpreters. What we mean there is that if you're a Jew or Christian and you read your sacred text, you interpret it one way, you are susceptible to making mistakes, and Muslims are no different. And they do interpret their text differently, just like Jews and Christians interpret their text differently. So you got to keep putting that in your mind, right? Not all Muslims believe the same thing and interpret their sacred text in the same way. The fact that interpreters of Islam were males living in a patriarchal society naturally affected the development of Islamic law and thought, especially its impact on women and the family. So we have to take them and their culture and their time and understand them according to their culture and their time. This is called, the official term is German, it's Sitzenleben, and it means their situation in life. So we see them coming out of this culture that's dominated by males, and what should we expect then but that this religion is probably going to be something that is headed by males. It's going to be a very odd thing to see it come out and flip-flop suddenly, because that's not the cultural way of thinking and understanding. So we have to take their culture and understand it as it reflects their time, and be careful as we try not to condemn them for what they're believing and what they're doing. Now, that doesn't mean that it simply is okay, because there are practices in the ancient world that I think were wrong then and are still wrong today, but I understand why that culture did what they did, and I don't condemn them for it. I'm not necessarily mad at them for it. I still think it's wrong, but I understand their thinking. And that's still true of people today in our culture. I don't agree with everybody in my culture, but I do take pains to try to understand both sides of, for example, the abortion debate. I want to understand both sides of it. Regardless of which side I end up on, I want to see both sides' perspective. And so as I'm looking at an ancient culture, I take that same approach. What is the culture? What was it that they were thinking and doing? What was their background? I don't necessarily have to agree with it, but I can at least attempt to understand it and perhaps not even condemn them for those actions. They are a product of the culture that they came from. That doesn't make it okay. Just like many Nazis were products of their culture, it doesn't mean that what they were doing was okay. It just means that we should understand it and perhaps extend a measure of grace to them, because in a way, sometimes some of these things are unavoidable. Not right, not acceptable, but perhaps it is something that we should extend grace towards, because that is what their culture was. And so that's hopefully understandable, and hopefully you can see what I mean there. All right, Islamic doctrines and laws developed in response to political and social questions and issues. Thus, it is correct to say there is one Islam revealed in the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet, but the Islamic tradition and heritage reveal many interpretations, some complementing each other, and others are in conflict. Just like within Christian interpretations today, I'm just going to say between Catholics and Protestants, we see that the majority of this stuff is agreed upon, and there is one revelation, there is one sacred text there within Christianity, but the interpretation of that text is going to have variety. Within that interpretation of the text, there's going to be conflict, and in Islam, there's the same issue. Muslims might say there's one revelation within the Quran, but the interpretations are going to differ, and sometimes Muslims are going to come into conflict with Muslims about the interpretation of that text. As Muslims today, like Jews and Christians, contend with the relationship of faith in the modern world, many questions arise. Take a religion that is hundreds of years old and then try to incorporate that into a world that has changed drastically. We see in the ancient world slavery, for example, and in the modern world we see slavery greatly on the decline. More and more and more slavery is being removed from our planet. It is certainly not removed, but it's become less and less acceptable, and in many cultures and in many countries has been pushed way to the side, where it's not just not acceptable but illegal. And so how do you then take a religion and incorporate it into a world where its view on slavery has radically changed, or its view on governments have radically changed, or the view on war has radically changed, or the view on women has radically changed, or the view on property rights has radically changed? And all of these things now, Islam is going to have to try to figure out where it stands with regard to the shifting culture of humanity. And I say that it's a very broad concept, that humans are beginning to move more and more towards a different set of ideas and ideals. And so how is Islam going to insert itself into this more, we just say, modern way of thinking? Judaism faces the same challenge. Christianity faces the same challenge. It's not unique to them, but it is something that is it's a problem that they're going to have to try to figure out how the right way to handle it is, and they're going to disagree, and so different Muslims are going to do different things, obviously. All right. Muslims also face questions regarding the relationship of the Islamic world to the West, as they're moving more and more from the Middle East and from the northern part of the African continent. How do they emerge or submerge or not within the traditions and the culture of Europe and now in America? And so that's something that has been very, very difficult for them. You come from a Middle Eastern culture, you move to the culture of the United States, the cultures are very different. How do you continue and keep your culture and tradition alive? Much like, remember, the Jews, as they were being spread out across the Mediterranean world, they were trying to maintain their faith, their religion. How could they do that after the temple was gone? It was synagogues, it was this, it was that, right? So they're facing that same kind of idea of spreading around the world to different cultures as the Jews did. Such perceptions, this idea of Islam moving into these different cultures, such perception lead both sides to foresee an impending clash of civilizations. Is it inevitable that the civilizations that the Muslims are coming from and that they're going into are going to clash with one another? And the answer really kind of is, it depends on the Muslim, as almost all answers are going to here. One of the things that we'll see later is that the women in the American culture today, coming from a Muslim culture, I see a lot of the grandmothers and mothers wearing the traditional outfit for Muslims, the hijab. But what I'm seeing more and more too is that the daughters, the younger generations, are rejecting the traditional clothing of the Muslims, and they're not wearing the headdress. And how is this going to be dealt with for the mom and the grandmother? Is it something that they accept? Hey, it's the daughter's choice, or is that something that they're going to hold them hard and fast to? Right? So we see these kinds of conflicts and difficulties that the Muslims are going to face as they're moving in, and is that ultimately going to result in conflict within the civilizations themselves? Can the Muslims incorporate themselves into the American culture without conflict? Will the American culture allow the Muslims to come in and incorporate themselves without conflict? Big question, hard thing to answer. I think it depends on the Muslim. I think it also probably depends on the community that they choose to try to incorporate themselves into. All right, the diverse but identifiable civilization that we call Islamic is the last great civilization to appear today. What does that mean? When we start talking about great civilizations, many people will think of the Egyptians or the Romans or the Greeks or whatever it is that you might think of, and that's correct. That's what we're talking about today, or even the civilizations from the East, Mongolians and Chinese, that kind of thing. This is kind of the last great one to arise. From then on, it's less these tremendous civilizations coming on the scene. It's more either a re-emergence of a civilization or the amalgamation of a civilization. That's always just fun to say. It's how they change and develop, but it's still a previous civilization. It still reflects one from the past. Islam is not that. It's not one that simply reflects another civilization from the past. It really is kind of a new creation here, and seems to be the last one to have been created. Its early development is the story of creative dynamism and distinctively Islamic religious, social, and political institutions that arose within initially Arab-dominated empire in the Mediterranean and Western Asian lands. So think Mesopotamia, think kind of the Middle East stretching over toward India and probably the western kind of part of China, that type area out there. That's where we're talking about here. And what's going to happen is that initially the people who were in the Middle Eastern part of the world, the majority of them are going to be predominantly nomadic. They're going to be using different modes of transportation, but certainly the camel, to move around. Remember us talking about how Abraham was a herdsman who moved wherever the grass or rain or whatever else there was. And so with these folks, they're going to be moving with different purposes, whether they are someone who raise goats or sheep or camels, or even if they're merchants, they're going to be someone who's traveling and trading. So they're constantly in motion. There's going to be cities here and there, but mostly the folks are nomads. They don't have a permanent home, so to speak. But eventually that's going to start to change. That region is going to become the population is going to increase, and this population of the cities is going to increase as trade starts to increase as well. So trade and finances, and once you have, the ability to make more money staying in a city, and you can raise your crops right here outside the city or whatever, just like we saw with the hunter-gatherers moving towards more of a city life, that this particular part of the world starts moving towards that as well. It creates some conflict early on. All of this is pre-Islam. Right now, all of these cultures are polytheistic. So there are many gods, just like the Romans were before Christianity, and the Greeks were polytheistic, and the Egyptians are polytheistic. So think polytheistic nomads. That was what it was, the majority of it. That mentality shifts from polytheistic nomad to polytheistic city dweller. It's not that the nomads were suddenly completely gone, it's just that more and more people were living in the cities. And so there's kind of a conflict that develops between the city Arabs and the nomad Arabians. They are separated by lifestyles. And so in my family, I am considered the city cousin because I don't live out in the country, and I don't make my living, whether that might be off of like a logging or chicken houses or pulpwood, if you know what that is, or anything like that. Um, I don't. That's not how I make my living anymore. I live in a city and I have a desk job. So I'm a city cousin, and many of my cousins are what we call country cousins. So there's no real conflict between us. It's not a big deal. We don't particularly care. It's just a lifestyle difference. In that time, though, that kind of lifestyle difference was more pronounced and more predominant. And so they're still polytheistic, but you start getting these differences in thinking. And if you've ever visited different cultures or even different parts of the United States, you find that the way people think is radically different. So I did grow up in the country doing a lot of manual labor